Everything you thought you knew about Senegal's economy. A silent revolution is sweeping across its fields, unlocking unprecedented wealth and forging unexpected global trade partnerships. Discover the incredible story of how high-yield sugarcane is not just growing, but booming, and what it means for the future of an entire region.
The transformation began quietly, like most revolutions in Africa. It did not begin with gunfire or protests, but with soil, dark, fertile soil stretching across the Senegal River Valley. For decades, Senegal had relied heavily on imported sugar, a painful contradiction for a land blessed with sun, water, and vast agricultural potential. Ships arrived at Dakar's port carrying bags of foreign sugar, while local farmers struggled to make their lands profitable. It was a silent wound on national pride, and over time, that wound turned into a vision. The idea was simple at first: grow more sugarcane. But what followed was anything but ordinary. Scientists, engineers, traditional farmers, and policymakers began to dream of something larger. Not just self-sufficiency, but leadership. Not just farming, but industrial power. Not just Senegal, but a Pan-African awakening built on something as ordinary and as powerful as sugar. Old colonial-era plantations once controlled by foreign commercial interests were gradually reclaimed. The land, once used merely as extraction zones for export, was transformed into centers of innovation. Senegalese agronomists began experimenting with hybrid sugarcane varieties that could withstand drought, resist crop diseases, and produce far higher yields. Within a few growing seasons, the change became visible. Sugarcane stalks rose taller, greener, stronger. Farmers who once harvested modest crops began seeing fields that looked like green oceans under the West African sun. But the sugarcane was only the beginning. As harvests expanded, the government made a decision that surprised the world. Instead of exporting raw sugarcane to be processed elsewhere, Senegal invested massively in local refineries. Giant sugar processing plants began rising from the fields, not as foreign outposts, but as national symbols of industrial ambition. Pipes, towers, and storage silos stood like monuments to Africa's shifting mindset, no longer suppliers of raw materials, but builders of finished value. This sugar boom did something rare. It unified people across class, region, and ideology. Farmers felt respected. Engineers found purpose. Youth found employment. Traditional leaders saw their communities revived. Cities felt the ripple effects as transportation networks improved and logistics hubs expanded. Railways extended like veins across the land, connecting plantations to factories, factories to ports, and ports to neighboring countries. And soon, the vision expanded beyond Senegal. Trucks loaded with Senegalese sugar traveled east into Mali and Burkina Faso, south into Guinea and Sierra Leone, and across coastal highways into Ivory Coast, Ghana, and Nigeria. African countries that once depended on European and Asian sugar suppliers started turning toward Dakar and St. Louis. It was not just trade, it was symbolism. African sugar, grown by African hands, processed by African industries, consumed by African families. The geopolitical implications were impossible to ignore. For the first time in modern history, a West African nation was using agriculture not only as an economic tool, but as a diplomatic weapon. Senegal began offering sugar trade agreements with long-term, low-cost contracts to African neighbors. These deals were built not on exploitation, but on partnership. The message was clear: Africa did not need to beg foreign corridors for basic commodities. Africa could feed itself. Africa could sweeten its own future. In response, regional alliances began to take shape. Countries with vast and used farmlands offered land exchange and joint farming initiatives. Shared irrigation projects were built across borders. West African engineers pooled knowledge and technology. Agricultural schools exploded in popularity. Young Africans no longer dreamed only of Europe or America. They dreamed of laboratories, farms, factories, and research centers on African soil. The sugarcane itself became a symbol of Pan-African unity. When droughts threatened one part of the region, reserve stock from Senegal flowed freely. When pests attacked crops in neighboring states, Senegalese scientists shared genetic solutions freely. Instead of competition, there was collaboration. Instead of dependency, there was dignity. However, global powers were watching. Western sugar corporations, once dominant in African markets, found their export volumes shrinking. Asian commodity traders saw long-standing supply contracts quietly dissolving. International financial institutions expressed concerns about sustainability while privately acknowledging that something irreversible was happening. Senegal's sugar boom was not just agricultural. It was strategic. It was ideological. It told a different story of Africa, not as a receiver of aid, but as an architect of its destiny. Inside the country, the social transformation was just as powerful. Once abandoned villages were revived. Infrastructure reached rural areas long ignored. Electricity grids, the sugar fields did more than alter Senegal's landscape. They rewired the psychology of an entire region. Where there was once quiet resignation, there was now strategy. Where there had once been dependency, there was now design. Senegal was no longer simply reacting to global markets. It was shaping them. This shift, slow and deliberate, inspired discussions far beyond agriculture. Ministries of transport, energy, education, and trade began aligning their long-term plans with one central belief. Africa must control its value chains. Ports were modernized not just to export sugar, but to serve as gateways for intra-African trade. Warehouses and cold storage facilities rose along transport corridors. Inland logistics hubs were built to make sure rural producers were never cut off from regional markets. What used to be fragmented national economies slowly began to feel like one growing continental machine, powered by confidence rather than charity. Senegal quietly became a reference point. Not a loud one, not a boastful one, but a respected one. Leaders from landlocked nations started asking different kinds of questions. Not, how do we get aid, but how do we replicate this? Technical teams began joint farming experiments across borders. Shared seed banks were created to protect African-owned genetics. Agricultural defense systems were designed to prevent foreign patent control over local crop improvements. This was Pan-Africanism not as a slogan, but as infrastructure. The sugarcane boom also changed defense thinking. Instead of armies being focused purely on conflict, strategic protection of farmland, water sources, and supply routes became a new kind of silent security policy. Borders became areas of cooperation rather than tension, with shared patrols protecting trade corridors. Stability was now measured not only in political terms, but in harvest success and food security. At global trade tables, Senegal's voice sounded different. Negotiations were no longer about survival, but about leverage. Sugar contracts came bundled with technology-sharing clauses, local employment quotas, and African-controlled logistics. Foreign companies were welcome, but only as partners, not masters. For the first time, African soil was pricing itself with dignity. The internal cultural effects were even deeper. Songs were written about farmers. Films celebrated irrigation engineers. Theater performances told stories of soil, science, and sovereignty. Young people didn't just want to be celebrities or influencers. They wanted to be innovators of land and industry. Pride was no longer abstract. It was productive. But prosperity always attracts pressure. As Senegal's model began to spread, global interest shifted from observation to intervention. Subtle diplomatic pressure began to emerge. Market manipulation attempts surfaced. Artificial sugar price drops were engineered to destabilize the boom. Competing exporters slashed prices to undercut African sugar's rise. Instead of panic, Africa coordinated. Reserve funds were created. Strategic stockpiles were filled. Regional price control mechanisms were activated. The continent learned to protect itself economically, without shouting, without drama, just disciplined coordination. It was a calm kind of resistance, far more powerful than noise. Environmental challenges surfaced as well. Rapid expansion risked water stress and biodiversity damage. But instead of ignoring these concerns, Senegal turned them into opportunities for African scientific leadership. Smart irrigation systems powered by solar energy were deployed. Water recycling technology spread across plantations. Biodiversity corridors were protected, ensuring the land wasn't sacrificed for growth. Again, Africa wasn't copying solutions. It was inventing its own. Years rolled forward, and the sugarcane industry evolved beyond anyone's early imagination. Bioplastics made from sugarcane waste replaced imported plastics. Eco-construction materials using cane fiber changed housing projects. Pharmaceutical research began using sugarcane derivatives for medical innovation. What began as agriculture had become a technological ecosystem. Senegal stopped being described as developing. It became described as pioneering. The most profound shift, however, was psychological. Africa no longer saw itself through foreign mirrors. It no longer needed permission to dream industrial dreams. Children born in this new era grew up assuming their continent was capable because they could see proof in factories, farms, laboratories, and trade networks. This was no longer a sugar revolution. It was a sovereignty revolution. Foreign powers eventually adjusted. They stopped trying to control the narrative and began adjusting to the new reality. Africa was no longer a passive market. It was an active architect. Any nation that wanted access had to respect African terms. And Senegal stood quietly at the heart of this change. Years later, travelers flying over the Senegal River Valley could see endless green, not the green of untapped potential, but the green of realized power. Solar panels glinted between cane fields. Trains moved silently along electrified tracks. Smoke from factories did not choke the air, but symbolized local production. No monuments were built. No giant statues erected. The real monument was invisible but undeniable, an Africa that had discovered itself. The sugarcane swayed in the wind, not as crops, but as flags. Not of a country, but of a continent. A continent that had learned to feed itself, power itself, fund itself, and believe in itself. The sweetness of the revolution was no longer just on tongues. It was in policies, in minds, in futures. And the world, slowly and reluctantly, began to understand a quiet truth. Africa was not rising. Africa had risen. The sugar fields did not simply change the land. They changed conversations. In Dakar, beneath wide concrete government buildings that once symbolized borrowed power, new debates had started forming. Ministers found themselves no longer discussing foreign loans to buy food, but export quotas to sell surplus sugar to struggling European markets. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same ships that once carried Senegal's raw resources away were now coming back asking for refined sweetness. But the sugar was never really about sweetness. It was about leverage. Across the continent, nations were watching. Ghana sent quiet observers. Nigeria sent economists. Ethiopia sent agricultural scientists disguised as cultural delegates. Everywhere, there was the same question. Was Senegal simply innovating, or was it igniting something much larger? In rural towns, the revolution felt different. Old men who once told their grandchildren stories of drought now spoke of irrigation systems designed by local engineers, powered not by foreign generators, but by cooperative solar farms stretching across the Sahel. Women who once sold imported sugar cubes at market stalls began selling locally processed brown sugar wrapped in cloth stamped with the words "sweetness of sovereignty." This was no longer just agriculture. This was identity. Yet power always attracts tension. One night, under a moon that hung low and red over the Atlantic, a confidential meeting took place in a quiet hotel overlooking the sea. The guests were not African. They were representatives of corporations that had long controlled global sugar prices. Their concern was simple. Senegal was upsetting balance sheets. Sugar prices were dropping in markets where their profits had remained stable for decades. They spoke softly, but their language was sharp. Sanctions were discussed. Trade delays were suggested. Rumors of environmental concerns were drafted before the meeting even ended. But Senegal had learned. Instead of responding with fear, it responded with alliances. What followed was quiet, strategic, and unmistakably Pan-African. Within months, a new framework was introduced, an African Agricultural Exchange Pact. Senegal did not claim leadership. It framed itself as a participant, but everyone knew where the idea had come from. Mali contributed land reforms. Burkina Faso contributed water conservation expertise. Nigeria contributed industrial processing technology. Suddenly, sugar was no longer Senegal's weapon alone. It became a symbol of cooperative independence. Ports once dominated by European logistics firms now saw new African-owned shipping containers. They were painted in deep green and gold, carrying grains, sugar, cocoa, and hope across the Atlantic, not as bargaining chips, but as statements. In the markets of Europe, the shift was undeniable. Sugar packets now bore small print labels, refined through African cooperative systems. That phrase unsettled powerful people. Inside Senegal, the psychological shift was even more profound. Farmers began to see themselves as architects of policy. Students began choosing agricultural engineering over foreign diplomacy. Songs emerged in local dialects glorifying soil, rain, and quiet defiance. Then came the summit, held in a newly built circular hall made from gold-tinted glass and red clay bricks. The leaders of several African nations gathered. They did not call it a political summit. They called it a harvest of futures. The world expected speeches about yield statistics. What they received was a philosophy. One speaker said calmly, "We are not exporting sugar. We are exporting a message. Africa can feed itself, fund itself, and define itself." The global reaction was divided. Some nations accused Senegal and its partners of destabilizing global trade. Others began privately negotiating trade agreements in new currencies. And in the sugar fields, the work continued. Drones built by African tech students flew low, monitoring moisture levels. Irrigation systems responded like living veins beneath the soil. The land had become a machine, not one powered by steel, but by cooperation. Yet revolutions are never smooth lines. A setback came in the form of climate stress. The rains delayed. The soil hardened. The sugarcane leaves began to curl at the edges. For a moment, old fears resurfaced. Some whispered that reliance on agriculture was still dangerous. Some suggested returning to international dependency for security. That thought didn't last. Instead, innovation deepened. Scientists from Rwanda arrived. Engineers from Egypt. Data analysts from Kenya. They did not come as rescuers, but as equals. They stayed in modest housing, ate in shared halls, and worked alongside local farmers. They did not just rescue the season. They perfected the system. The yield didn't just return. It doubled. Word of this spread beyond Africa. South American farmers began adapting Senegalese irrigation blueprints. Asian researchers began studying the African cooperative model. And in small Senegalese classrooms, children traced maps that no longer colored Africa as dependent, but as dynamic. Then came the symbolic moment. A global food summit, traditionally held in Western capitals, was moved to Dakar. For the first time in history, global food policy discussions happened not in skyscrapers, but within view of active farmland. Foreign delegates stood on platforms overlooking endless green fields. They had no choice but to confront reality. Africa was not catching up. Africa was leading. By now, the sugar revolution had grown beyond its root. Financial institutions were being rebuilt. Trade routes were being redrawn. Policies once dictated from above were now shaped from within. Senegal had not overthrown systems with weapons. It had done something more terrifying to old powers. It had made them irrelevant. And still, the sugar grew. The final turning point came quietly. No announcements. No ceremonies. Just a single export report leaked into the world's media. It showed that African-led agricultural alliances were now feeding not just themselves, but supporting food stability in 3 other continents. A journalist wrote, "The world is no longer asking whether Africa can sustain itself. It is asking how Africa learned to do it without permission." In Senegal, farmers didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as normal people who simply stopped waiting. And in the soil, thick and dark and honest, sugarcane roots tightened their grip, drawing nutrients from land that had once been dismissed. The revolution had never been about sugar. It had been about dignity. And dignity, once grown, cannot be uprooted.